In the winter of 1798, a 12-year-old girl named Mercy Harrow disappeared from the remote wilderness of Kentucky, leaving behind only blood-stained clothing and a diary filled with the most disturbing confessions ever recorded on the American frontier. For over 2 centuries, historians have debated whether the events described in those pages could possibly be true. But recently discovered court documents from the territorial government suggest that something far more sinister than anyone imagined was happening along the treacherous wilderness trail. The diary reveals not just the story of a child bride's tragic fate, but evidence of a systematic murder operation that claimed the lives of at least 47 innocent families seeking new lives in the Western Territories. What makes this case particularly haunting is that Mercy Harrow wasn't just a victim. She may have been the only witness to one of the most prolific killing sprees in early American history, trapped in a nightmare where her own husband was the architect of unspeakable horrors. Before we continue with the story of Mercy Harrow and the dark secrets buried along Kentucky's wilderness trail, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments what state or city you're listening from. Because this story shows us that evil can hide behind the most charming faces, even in the places we call home. The tale begins not with murder, but with what appeared to be an innocent romance that would soon spiral into one of the most chilling discoveries in frontier history. The Kentucky of 1798 was a land caught between civilization and wilderness, where the promise of fertile farmland drew thousands of families westward along the notorious Wilderness Trail. This narrow, treacherous path cut through the Cumberland Gap, winding through dense forests and rocky gorges where travelers often disappeared without a trace. The territorial government attributed most disappearances to hostile Cherokee raids, wild animals, or simple accidents. After all, the frontier was unforgiving, and death was a constant companion for those brave enough to seek their fortunes in the Western Territories. Cumberland County, where our story unfolds, was particularly isolated in those days. The nearest territorial courthouse was 3 days hard riding through dangerous terrain, and law enforcement consisted of a handful of appointed magistrates who rarely ventured beyond the established settlements. This lawless landscape became the perfect hunting ground for those with darker intentions, where a man could disappear a family and face no questions, where screams in the night were dismissed as the sounds of nature claiming another victim. It was into this harsh world that 11-year-old Mercy Harrow arrived in the autumn of 1797, orphaned when her parents succumbed to fever during their journey from Virginia. She had been traveling with the Caldwell family, distant relatives who reluctantly agreed to care for her until they could find her more permanent arrangements in one of the established settlements. But fate, or perhaps something far more sinister, had other plans for young Mercy. The girl was striking even at her tender age, with auburn hair that caught the firelight and green eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. She possessed an unusual intelligence, having been taught to read and write by her mother, skills that were rare among frontier children. These very qualities that should have been her greatest assets would soon become the tools of her entrapment, making her both an ideal victim and the perfect witness to horrors that would haunt her brief remaining days. Daniel Crenshaw appeared in their camp on a cold October evening, like an answer to the Caldwell family's prayers. At 19, he was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came from surviving on the frontier. His dark hair was neatly trimmed despite the wilderness setting, his clothes were well maintained, and most importantly, he spoke with the cultured accent of someone who had received an education back east. When he claimed to be a professional guide who helped families navigate the dangerous passages to the fertile lands beyond the mountains, the Caldwells saw him as a godsend. "I've been guiding families through these trails for 3 years now," Daniel told them that first night, his voice warm and reassuring around the campfire. "Lost only 2 families to Cherokee raids, and that was early on before I learned all the safe routes. These days, I can get you through without seeing a single hostile face." What the Caldwells couldn't know was that Daniel Crenshaw had indeed been in the wilderness for 3 years, but not as a guide. He had been perfecting something far more sinister. A system of murder so efficient and well disguised that the territorial authorities never suspected the truth. The two families he claimed to have lost to Cherokee raids had not fallen victim to hostile natives. They had died by Daniel's own hand, their bodies fed to the wilderness, while their possessions funded his increasingly elaborate schemes. Young Mercy first noticed Daniel watching her during the evening meal on his second day with their group. While the adults discussed routes and provisions, she felt his eyes upon her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter in ways she didn't understand. At 11, she had never experienced romantic attention, but there was something in Daniel's gaze that spoke to the part of her that was already beginning to mature into womanhood. "You're quite different from most frontier girls," he said to her quietly as she helped clean the cooking pots by the stream. "You have learning. I can see it in how you carry yourself. Your parents taught you to read, didn't they?" Mercy nodded shyly, surprised by his attention. "Mama said education was the one thing no one could take from me, no matter how poor we became." Daniel smiled, and in the flickering light of the dying campfire, his expression seemed almost tender. "Your mother was a wise woman. Intelligence in a woman is a rare and precious thing out here. Most of these frontier families treat their daughters like breeding stock, but you could be something special." Those words planted the first seeds of what would become Mercy's downfall. In a world where she had been treated as a burden since her parents' death, Daniel's attention felt like salvation. He began seeking her out for small conversations, asking about the books she had read, listening to her thoughts about their journey with what seemed like genuine interest. The Caldwell family, grateful for Daniel's guidance and eager to reach their destination before winter set in completely, failed to notice the subtle courtship taking place right under their noses. They were too focused on the practical matters of survival to pay attention to the way their young charge's eyes lit up whenever the handsome guide spoke to her, or how she had begun taking extra care with her appearance each morning. It was on the night of October 23rd, 1797, that Daniel made his move. Not on the Caldwells, but on Mercy's heart. He approached her as she sat apart from the others, writing in the small journal her mother had given her before dying. "I've been thinking about something," he said, settling beside her on the fallen log where she sat. "The Caldwells plan to leave you with the Methodist mission in Lexington, don't they?" Mercy nodded, her heart sinking at the reminder. She had been dreading that moment for weeks. "That's no life for a girl like you," Daniel continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "Those mission women will try to break your spirit, make you into another docile frontier wife, pumping out babies for some farmer who can't even read his own name." "What choice do I have?" Mercy asked, her voice barely audible. "I have no family, no money, nowhere else to go." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his words would seal both their fates. "You could come with me." The proposal that followed was everything a romantic 11-year-old girl could dream of. Daniel painted a picture of a life filled with adventure and purpose. She would be his partner in guiding families to safety, using her intelligence and education to help him keep detailed records of routes and weather patterns. They would travel together through the most beautiful wilderness in America, building a life based on helping others achieve their dreams. "I know you're young," he said, taking her small hand in his larger one. "But frontier life makes adults of children quickly. You're already more mature than girls 3 years older who've lived sheltered lives back east. I can protect you, provide for you, and give you a purpose that makes use of your gifts." What Mercy couldn't see in the darkness was the cold calculation behind Daniel's romantic words. He had been watching her not with love, but with the predatory instincts of someone who recognized a perfect victim. Her intelligence made her useful. Her orphaned status made her vulnerable, and her youth made her malleable. Most importantly, her education meant she could serve a specific purpose in his growing operation, keeping detailed records that would help him identify the wealthiest targets and plan their elimination with military precision. The wedding took place 3 days later, in a crude ceremony performed by a traveling preacher Daniel claimed to have encountered on the trail. The Caldwells, relieved to have Mercy's future settled without the expense and trouble of delivering her to Lexington, gave their blessing readily. They even contributed some of their precious supplies as a wedding gift, never suspecting they were funding the beginning of something monstrous. As Mercy Harrow became Mercy Crenshaw on that cold autumn morning, she believed she was the luckiest girl on the frontier. Within 2 months, she would be pregnant. Within 6 months, she would discover the true nature of the man she had married. And within 8 months, she would be dead. But not before recording the most terrifying account of systematic murder ever documented on the American frontier. The nightmare was about to begin. The first winter of Mercy's marriage passed like a dream she would later describe in her diary as too beautiful to last. Daniel had built them a sturdy cabin in a secluded valley about 15 miles from the main wilderness trail, hidden among old-growth oaks and protected by steep rocky outcroppings that made it nearly invisible to passing travelers. The location, he explained, was perfect for their guide service. Close enough to the trail to intercept families in need of help, but remote enough to provide privacy and safety. Mercy threw herself into the role of frontier wife, with the enthusiasm of a girl finally finding her place in the world. She kept meticulous records in her neat handwriting, documenting weather patterns, noting which passes remained clear of snow, and tracking the movements of game that would indicate safe camping sites. Daniel praised her work constantly, telling her she was invaluable to their operation. "You have a mind for details that most men lack," he would say, reviewing her careful notes by candlelight. "When spring comes and the heavy migration begins, we'll be the most successful guide service on the trail. We'll be able to pick and choose only the best families, the ones with real money to pay for quality service." It was during those long winter evenings that Mercy fell completely under Daniel's spell. He was an educated man who had attended college in Philadelphia before heading west, and he shared with her books he claimed to have carried from his former life. They read together by the fire, Shakespeare's sonnets, passages from the Bible, even some of the philosophical works that were becoming popular among educated Americans. For a girl who had feared she would never again have access to learning, these evenings felt like paradise. The pregnancy began in December, and Mercy's joy was complete. At 12, she felt mature enough to handle the responsibilities of motherhood, especially with Daniel's constant support and encouragement. He was tender with her during the difficult early months, preparing special teas to ease her morning sickness and rubbing her feet when they swelled from long days of walking. But there were small things that began to trouble her as winter gave way to spring. Daniel would disappear for days at a time, claiming he was scouting routes for the coming season, but he never invited her to accompany him despite her knowledge of the terrain. When he returned from these trips, he always brought supplies: flour, salt, sometimes even luxury items like real coffee or white sugar. But his explanations for how he had acquired them grew increasingly vague. "Found a traveling merchant whose wagon broke down," he might say, or "traded some furs to a Cherokee chief for safe passage." The stories never quite added up, but Mercy was too happy and too trusting to question them seriously. The first family arrived at their cabin in early April 1798, just as the snows were finally melting from the high passes. The Harmons were traveling from North Carolina with their 3 children, seeking farmland in the bluegrass region around Lexington. They were exactly the type of clients Daniel had taught Mercy to expect. Hard-working people with enough money to pay for professional guidance, but not wealthy enough to afford a large, well-armed escort. Mercy was excited to finally begin their legitimate guide service, but Daniel's behavior during the Harmons' 3-day stay struck her as oddly secretive. He spent long hours in private conversation with Mr. Harmon, asking detailed questions about their finances, their planned destination, and their intended route after leaving his service. He also insisted that Mercy remain inside the cabin during most of their visit, claiming that her pregnancy made it inappropriate for her to socialize extensively with their male clients. "I'm protecting your reputation," he explained when she protested. "Frontier people can be suspicious of a guide with such a young wife. They might think it reflects poorly on my judgment." The explanation made sense. But Mercy found herself watching from the cabin window as Daniel led the Harmon family away toward the main trail. Something in his posture, a tension she had never seen before, made her uneasy. When he returned 2 days later, alone and claiming the family had decided to travel with another group they had encountered, her unease deepened. "Did they pay you?" she asked, noticing that he seemed to have acquired several items she didn't recognize. A silver pocket watch, a woman's shawl of fine wool, a child's wooden toy horse. "Of course," Daniel replied, but his voice carried a sharp edge she had never heard before. "They were very generous, said my knowledge of the trail was worth every penny." That night, as Daniel slept beside her, Mercy lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest and trying to understand why her happiness felt so fragile. In her diary she wrote, "Something has changed in Daniel since the Harmons left. He seems different, more watchful. I tell myself it is only the stress of beginning our business, but I cannot shake the feeling that there are things he is not telling me. I pray I am wrong, for what would I do if the man I love was not the man I believed him to be?" It was a question that would soon be answered in the most horrifying way possible. The second family arrived in late April, and this time Mercy's suspicions crystallized into genuine fear. The Pritchards were a wealthy merchant family from Richmond, traveling with 2 wagons loaded with expensive household goods and a strong box that Mr. Pritchard made no effort to conceal. They had hired Daniel specifically because his reputation as a reliable guide had spread among the better-class emigrants heading west. But from the moment the Pritchards made camp near their cabin, Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He insisted that Mercy remain hidden entirely during their stay, claiming she was too ill with pregnancy complications to receive visitors. When she protested that she felt perfectly well, his response chilled her to the bone. "You will do as I say, Mercy, without question. There are aspects of this business you're too young and innocent to understand. Your job is to trust me and follow my instructions exactly." The tone was so harsh, so unlike the gentle husband she had known, that Mercy found herself obeying without further argument. But her compliance didn't stop her from watching and listening from the cabin's single window as Daniel entertained their guests. What she observed over the next 3 days filled her with growing dread. Daniel was asking the same probing questions he had asked the Harmons, but with the intensity that seemed almost predatory. He wanted to know exactly how much money they carried, what their travel plans were beyond his guidance, and most disturbingly, whether anyone back in Virginia was expecting regular correspondence from them during their journey. "We're hoping to establish ourselves quickly," Mrs. Pritchard confided during one evening meal that Mercy could hear clearly from her hiding place. "My husband has letters of introduction to several businessmen in Lexington, and we're hoping to purchase a large tract of land before winter." "Wise planning," Daniel replied, and even from a distance Mercy could hear something cold in his voice. "And no doubt your family back in Richmond will be eager for news of your safe arrival." "Oh, we have no family left in Virginia," Mr. Pritchard said with a laugh. "That's part of why we're making this move. We're free to start completely fresh with no one depending on us or expecting regular letters." That night, Mercy heard Daniel moving around outside the cabin long after their guests had retired to their wagons. When she peered through the window, she saw him examining the Pritchards' horses and wagons with the focused attention of someone conducting an inventory. The sight sent ice through her veins, though she couldn't yet articulate why. The next morning, Daniel announced that he would personally escort the Pritchards through the most dangerous section of the trail, a narrow passage through Devil's Canyon where Cherokee raids were supposedly common. He would be gone for at least a week, he told Mercy, and she was to remain at the cabin no matter what she heard or saw. "Promise me," he said, gripping her shoulders with painful intensity. "Promise me you won't leave this cabin for any reason until I return." Mercy promised, but as she watched Daniel lead the heavily loaded Pritchard wagons toward the canyon trail, every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. She spent the day pacing the cabin like a caged animal, her pregnancy making her movements awkward, but doing nothing to calm her agitation. It was near sunset when she heard the first gunshot echoing from the direction of Devil's Canyon. Then another. Then screaming, high-pitched and desperate, cut short with terrifying abruptness. The sounds continued for perhaps 10 minutes before fading into a silence that seemed to swallow the entire forest. Mercy spent that night huddled in the cabin with Daniel's hunting rifle across her lap, jumping at every sound from the darkness outside. When morning came with no sign of his return, she made a decision that would change everything. She would venture just far enough toward the canyon to see if she could determine what had happened. The trail to Devil's Canyon was easy to follow, marked by the deep ruts of the Pritchard wagons and the hoof prints of their horses. But about 2 miles from the cabin, Mercy made a discovery that stopped her cold. There, partially hidden behind a large boulder, was a camp that was clearly not temporary. Someone had been using this site regularly, and recently, there were the remains of multiple campfires, ropes that had been used to tie people or animals, and most damning of all, scattered personal belongings that she recognized as having come from families Daniel claimed to have guided successfully to their destinations. A child's dress that had belonged to one of the Harmon children, Mr. Pritchard's distinctive brass compass. A woman's wedding ring that she was certain she had seen on Mrs. Harmon's finger. But it was what she found hidden beneath a canvas tarp that shattered her world completely. Daniel had been keeping trophies, not just valuable items, but personal mementos that told the story of systematic murder. There were locks of hair tied with ribbon, family photographs, children's toys, and most horrifying of all, a collection of final letters that victims had apparently been forced to write before their deaths. One letter, in a woman's shaking handwriting, read, "To whoever finds this, my name is Margaret Harmon, and we were murdered by our guide, Daniel Crenshaw, on April 12, 1798. He promised safe passage, but led us into an ambush. He is not alone. Tell our families in North Carolina that we died loving them." As Mercy stood there with the evidence of her husband's true nature scattered around her feet, she felt the baby kick inside her belly and realized the full scope of her nightmare. She was carrying the child of a monster, trapped in the wilderness with no one to turn to and nowhere to run. But perhaps most terrifying of all, she now understood why Daniel had been so eager to marry her, why he valued her intelligence and education so highly. She was his record keeper, his accountant of murder. Every detail she had carefully documented about weather patterns and trail conditions was being used to plan the perfect conditions for killing. Every note she had made about family finances and travel plans was intelligence that helped him select the most profitable victims. Mercy Crenshaw was not Daniel's beloved wife. She was an unwitting accomplice to mass murder, and she was running out of time to decide whether she would continue in that role or find a way to stop him before he killed again. The sound of approaching horses told her that decision time had come sooner than she expected. Mercy barely had time to cover the evidence and scramble back toward the cabin before Daniel appeared on the trail, leading the Pritchards' horses but notably lacking the Pritchards themselves. His clothes were mud-stained and there were scratches on his face, but he carried himself with the satisfied air of a man who had completed a successful business transaction. "Mercy," he called out with forced cheerfulness as he spotted her on the trail. "What are you doing out here? I told you to stay at the cabin." "I heard gunshots," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I was worried about you. Where are the Pritchards?" Daniel's expression darkened for just a moment before returning to its practiced warmth. "Cherokee raid, just as I feared. Happened so fast there was nothing I could do. I barely escaped with my life, had to hide in the rocks for 2 days before I was sure they were gone." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that Mercy realized he had told this same story many times before. But now she knew what to look for, and she could see the calculation behind his eyes as he gauged whether she believed him. "How terrible," she managed to say. Did they suffer?" "It was quick," Daniel said, his hand moving unconsciously to the knife at his belt. "That's all we can hope for in this wilderness." As they walked back to the cabin together, Mercy's mind raced through everything she had seen and heard over the past months. The suspicious supplies Daniel brought back from his scouting trips. His detailed questions about their clients' finances and family connections, the way he had insisted she remain hidden from view, and now the evidence hidden near Devil's Canyon that proved he was systematically murdering the families who trusted him with their lives. But what terrified her most was the realization that Daniel was not working alone. The evidence pointed to a larger operation, and she began to understand why he had married her. A young, pregnant wife provided the perfect cover for a man whose business required him to appear trustworthy and settled. Who would suspect a devoted family man of being a cold-blooded killer? That evening, as Daniel sorted through the Pritchards' belongings with the casual efficiency of long practice, Mercy made another chilling discovery. In her sewing basket, hidden beneath balls of yarn, she found a small leather journal that she had never seen before. When she opened it during a moment when Daniel was outside tending to the horses, she found page after page of meticulous records written in his neat handwriting. The journal was a ledger of murder. Every family Daniel had guided over the past 3 years was listed with details of their financial worth, their planned destinations, and the methods used to kill them. The Harmons had been shot during a staged Cherokee attack. The Pritchards had been poisoned with hemlock extract and then finished off with knives to make their deaths appear violent. But it was the final entries that made Mercy's blood run cold. Daniel was planning to kill her immediately after the baby was born. In his calculation, a crying infant would be a liability that could attract unwanted attention, and a wife who had seen too much was an even greater risk. He had already identified a story to explain her disappearance. She would die in childbirth, a common enough occurrence on the frontier that no one would question it. The journal also revealed the scope of his operation. Daniel was part of a network of at least 6 men who worked different sections of the Wilderness Trail, sharing information about wealthy targets and coordinating their attacks to avoid suspicion. They had killed at least 47 families over the past 3 years, accumulating a fortune in gold, jewelry, and valuable goods that they converted to cash through contacts in New Orleans and Charleston. As Mercy sat there reading the documented evidence of mass murder, she felt the baby kick violently inside her, as if responding to her terror. She was 7 months pregnant, isolated in the wilderness with a man who planned to kill her in 2 months, and she had no idea how many other killers might be nearby. But perhaps most terrifying of all, she realized that someone was watching her read the journal. Through the cabin window, she could see a figure moving in the tree line. Someone Daniel had not told her about. Someone who had been observing their cabin for who knew how long. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Mercy's situation intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this nightmare that consumed the Kentucky wilderness. When Daniel returned to the cabin that night, Mercy forced herself to act normally despite the journal hidden beneath her mattress. But she noticed that he kept glancing toward the window, and she realized he was communicating with whoever was watching from the forest. The net was closing around her, and she was running out of time to save not only her own life, but the life of her unborn child. The next morning brought a new horror. A 4th family was approaching their cabin, and from Daniel's reaction, Mercy knew they would not survive the encounter. The Carver family arrived on a crisp morning in early June, and Mercy knew immediately that they were walking into a death trap. John Carver was a prosperous lawyer from Charleston, traveling with his pregnant wife, 2 young daughters, and a wagon loaded with law books, fine furniture, and a chest that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins when it was unloaded. Daniel's eyes lit up when he saw their wealth, but Mercy also noticed something else. Hand signals being exchanged between her husband and figures moving through the trees surrounding their cabin. The network was mobilizing for what would clearly be their most profitable kill yet. "Mr. Carver," Daniel said with his most charming smile, "you've come at the perfect time. I know exactly the route to get your family safely to Lexington, and with 2 pregnant ladies to consider, we'll take extra precautions." As the families set up camp near the cabin, Mercy fought a desperate internal battle. She had spent weeks planning how she might escape Daniel's control, but she had never imagined she would be forced to watch innocent people walk toward their deaths. The Carver children, aged 8 and 10, were playing near the stream while their parents discussed travel plans with Daniel, completely unaware that they had perhaps hours left to live. The eldest Carver daughter, Sarah, reminded Mercy painfully of herself at that age, bright, curious, full of questions about the world around her. The girl had approached Mercy earlier that morning, fascinated by the idea of meeting another young wife on the frontier. "Are you really only 13? Sarah had asked with the innocent directness of childhood. "Mama says I won't be ready for marriage for years yet, but you seem so grown up and wise." Those words cut through Mercy like a knife, reminding her of how quickly innocence could be destroyed on the frontier. She looked at Sarah's trusting face and saw herself 8 months earlier, believing in Daniel's promises and dreaming of a romantic life in the wilderness. The parallels were too painful to ignore. Throughout the day, Mercy watched Daniel work his deadly charm on the Carver family. He regaled them with stories of successful journeys, showed them his carefully drawn maps, and discussed the safest routes through Cherokee territory with the authority of someone who had genuinely guided families to safety. His performance was so convincing that even Mercy, who knew the truth, found herself momentarily believing in the fiction. But she also noticed the subtle preparations being made for murder. Daniel's scouting trips around the camp were actually reconnaissance missions, identifying the best positions for his accomplices to attack. His detailed questions about the family's finances were intelligence gathering for the theft that would follow their deaths. And his insistence on leaving early the next morning was designed to get them away from the cabin before any other travelers might witness what was about to happen. That evening, as both families shared a meal around the campfire, Mercy made her decision. When Mrs. Carver complimented the stew and asked for the recipe, Mercy saw her opportunity. "I'd be happy to write it down for you," Mercy said, reaching for her journal. "But I should mention, I use a special herb that grows only in certain parts of these mountains. Let me show you where to find it." Daniel shot her a sharp look, but Mrs. Carver's enthusiasm seemed harmless enough. As Mercy led the pregnant woman toward the stream under the pretense of gathering herbs, she whispered urgently, "You must listen to me very carefully. Your lives depend on it." Mrs. Carver's face went pale as Mercy quickly explained what she had discovered about Daniel's true profession. At first, the woman clearly thought Mercy was suffering from pregnancy-induced hysteria. But when Mercy showed her the hidden journal pages she had torn out and hidden in her apron, Mrs. Carver's disbelief turned to terror. "My God," Mrs. Carver whispered, her hands shaking as she read Daniel's meticulous records of murder. "How many families? How long has this been happening?" 3 years at least," Mercy replied, her voice barely audible above the sound of the stream. "Maybe longer. Your family isn't just random victims. Daniel chose you specifically because you're wealthy, traveling alone, and no one back in Charleston is expecting regular letters." Mrs. Carver's face crumpled as the full implications hit her. "The children. Oh God, what about my children?" We have to warn my husband," she whispered. "No," Mercy said firmly, gripping the woman's arm. "Daniel's not alone. There are at least 3 others watching us right now. If you act suspicious, they'll kill everyone immediately. We need a different plan." The plan that followed was born of desperation and the kind of courage that only emerges when faced with absolute evil. Mercy had spent months studying Daniel's operation, learning his signals, understanding his methods. She knew that his network relied on coordination and timing. If she could disrupt either, she might create enough confusion to give the Carvers a chance to escape. "Listen carefully," Mercy whispered. "Mercy, Daniel will suggest leaving at dawn, taking you through Devil's Canyon where the attacks usually happen. But tonight, I'm going to create a diversion. When you see the signal fires, you take your family and run toward the main trail. Don't stop, don't look back. And don't trust anyone you meet until you reach the territorial militia post at Boonesborough. What about you, Mrs. Carver asked, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at Mercy's swollen belly. I can't run, Mercy said simply, but I can give you time. That's all that matters now. What followed was the most desperate gambit of Mercy's young life. She convinced Mrs. Carver to return to camp and act normally while she made her final preparations. That night, as the adults settled down to sleep and Daniel made his preparations for what he believed would be an easy kill, Mercy put her plan into motion. She had spent hours studying Daniel's journal, and she knew that his method relied on surprise and the isolation of the victims. But she had also noticed something else. The killers were superstitious men who feared anything that might attract the attention of territorial authorities. If she could create enough noise and confusion, they might decide the risk was too great and abandon their plan. At midnight, Mercy crept from the cabin, moving with the careful stealth Daniel had taught her during their months together. Her pregnancy made her movements awkward, but adrenaline and desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. First, she made her way to where the Carvers' horses were tied, quietly leading the animals away from the camp and toward a hidden grove she had prepared earlier. Then came the most dangerous part of her plan. Using flint and steel she had taken from Daniel's supplies, she began lighting the series of signal fires she had prepared throughout the day. Small piles of dry kindling arranged in the pattern that Daniel's network used to communicate authorities approaching. The first fire caught quickly, sending orange flames dancing against the night sky. Then the second and the third. Within minutes, the entire valley was illuminated by warning fires that could be seen for miles in every direction. The effect was immediate and chaotic. Daniel burst from the cabin to find his wife missing, the client's horses gone, and signal fires burning in what appeared to be a warning that law enforcement was closing in. In the darkness and confusion, he couldn't determine whether Mercy had been taken by his own men or had somehow escaped on her own. "Mercy!" He roared into the night, his voice carrying all the rage of a predator whose carefully laid plans had been disrupted. "What have you done?" But Mercy was already moving to the next phase of her plan. While Daniel and his hidden accomplices tried to understand what was happening, she crept back toward the Carver camp, where Mrs. Carver was already awakening her family and preparing them for flight. "The horses are waiting in the grove beyond the creek," Mercy whispered urgently. "Follow the stream until you see the white stone marker I left, then turn east toward the main trail." "Come with us," Mrs. Carver pleaded, but Mercy shook her head. "Someone has to stay to keep them confused. If we all disappear at once, they'll know what happened and track you down. This way, they'll waste time looking for me first." The next few minutes were a heart-stopping dance of stealth and terror as the Carver family crept through the darkness towards safety. 8-year-old Mary Carver stumbled over a fallen log and cried out in pain, the sound echoing through the forest like a gunshot. Suddenly, Daniel's voice was roaring through the darkness. "Find them! Find them all! No witnesses!" What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse through the Kentucky wilderness, with a heavily pregnant 13-year-old girl trying to guide a terrified family to safety, while killers closed in from all directions. Mercy's intimate knowledge of the terrain gave her an advantage, but Daniel knew her too well. He could predict where she would go and how she would think. The chase lasted until dawn, with the sounds of pursuit growing closer with each passing hour. Daniel's men had spread out through the forest, using hunting calls to coordinate their movements as they systematically searched every possible hiding place. Several times, the Carvers came within yards of discovery, saved only by Mercy's quick thinking and knowledge of hidden caves and animal paths. But exhaustion and Mercy's advancing pregnancy finally forced them to take shelter in a cave she had discovered months earlier during her explorations of the surrounding wilderness. The Carver family huddled in the darkness while Mercy kept watch, her diary clutched in her hands as she wrote what she believed would be her final words. "If we are found, I want it known that Daniel Crenshaw and his men have murdered at least 47 families on the Wilderness Trail. They are not Cherokee raiders or common bandits. They are organized killers who use the isolation of the frontier to prey on innocent families seeking new lives. I pray that someone will find this record and bring them to justice, for I fear we will not live to see another sunrise. But sunrise brought an unexpected sight. A column of territorial militia riding hard up the main trail, led by Captain James Whitfield, who was following reports of signal fires and suspicious activity in the area. The very authorities Daniel feared had been approaching all along, drawn by reports from other travelers who had noticed the unusual number of abandoned campsites and scattered belongings along the trail. As the militia surrounded Daniel's cabin and began their investigation, Mercy faced the most difficult decision of her life. She could reveal everything she knew and ensure that the killers faced justice. But doing so would also expose her own role as an unwitting accomplice and likely result in her own arrest, or worse. In the end, the choice was made for her when Daniel, realizing that capture was inevitable, decided to eliminate the only witness who could tie him to the murders. As the militia closed in on his position, he came for Mercy with a knife, determined that if he was going down, he would take his pregnant wife with him. "You've destroyed everything," he snarled as he cornered her near the cave entrance. 3 years of careful work, ruined by a stupid little girl who couldn't mind her own business. The final confrontation was brief, but brutal. Daniel's rage had made him careless, and Mercy had prepared for this moment during the long night of running and hiding. As he lunged at her with the knife, she managed to get her hands on one of his own pistols, a weapon she had learned to use during their months together on the frontier. The shot that followed echoed through the Kentucky mountains like thunder, bringing the territorial militia running toward the sound. They found Daniel Crenshaw dead and Mercy Harrow dying, her hands still clutched around the weapon that had ended one of the most systematic murder operations in frontier history. The final pages of Mercy's diary, discovered clutched in the hands of a 13-year-old girl who had died protecting not only the Carver family, but the evidence that would expose one of the most systematic murder operations in frontier history, became the foundation for the most significant criminal investigation in the early history of the Kentucky Territory. Captain James Whitfield of the Kentucky Territorial Militia, a veteran of Indian warfare who had seen more than his share of frontier violence, would later write in his official report that he had never encountered anything as methodical and cold-blooded as Daniel Crenshaw's operation. The physical evidence was overwhelming once investigators knew where to look, and Mercy's detailed documentation provided a roadmap that led to discoveries far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The hidden camp near Devil's Canyon yielded the remains of dozens of victims carefully buried in unmarked graves that would have remained hidden forever, if not for Mercy's courage. The cache of stolen goods found at the site was worth an estimated $15,000, an enormous fortune for the time, representing the life savings of families who had sold everything they owned to start fresh in the Western Territories. But perhaps most chilling was Daniel's meticulous record-keeping, which revealed the true scope of his network's activities. Every family murdered over the past 3 years was documented with clinical precision. Their names, ages, financial worth, and the specific methods used to kill them. The record showed a level of organization that shocked even hardened militia officers, with detailed maps of attack sites, schedules coordinating multiple killers, and even backup plans for disposing of evidence if their primary methods failed. Mrs. Carver's testimony, delivered through tears before a packed courthouse in Lexington, painted a vivid picture of Mercy's final hours. She described how a pregnant child had risked everything to save a family of strangers, using intelligence and courage that belied her tender years. The testimony was so powerful that several jurors wept openly, and the courtroom erupted in applause when she finished speaking. The investigation that followed Mercy's sacrifice led to the arrest of 7 men involved in the network, though authorities suspected that at least 3 others had escaped to other territories before they could be apprehended. Under interrogation, the captured killers confessed to systematic murders spanning multiple states and territories, revealing an operation far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The network had been operating for at least 5 years, not 3, as Daniel's records suggested. They had killed families throughout Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and the Carolina territories, always careful to spread their activities across different jurisdictions to avoid detection. The total number of victims was estimated at over 70 families. More than 300 men, women, and children who had simply vanished into the American wilderness. The methods used were as varied as they were brutal. Some families were poisoned with plant extracts that mimicked natural illnesses. Others were shot during staged Indian attacks, with the killers scalping their victims to make the murders appear authentic. Still others simply disappeared without a trace, their bodies fed to the wilderness, while their possessions were sold through criminal contacts in major cities. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational criminal cases in early American history. Families of victims traveled from across the eastern states to witness justice being served, and newspaper coverage of the proceedings reached as far as Boston and Philadelphia. The 7 surviving killers were hanged in Lexington on September 15, 1798, before crowds that numbered in the thousands. But perhaps more importantly, Mercy's diary led to sweeping changes in how territorial governments approached frontier law enforcement. The case exposed dangerous gaps in communication between different jurisdictions, allowing criminals to operate across territorial boundaries without fear of detection. New protocols were established requiring regular reports between territorial militias, and a system of wanted notices was created to track suspected criminals across state lines. New regulations required all professional guides to be licensed and bonded through territorial authorities, with mandatory check-ins at established outposts along major migration routes. Families traveling dangerous passages were provided with coded signals they could use to request help, and militia patrols were increased dramatically throughout remote regions where murders had occurred. The wilderness trail itself was transformed by these changes. Guard stations were established at key points along the route, and travelers were required to register their passage and report their safe arrival at designated checkpoints. The system, while not perfect, made it virtually impossible for another operation like Daniel's to succeed. The impact extended beyond law enforcement. Churches throughout the frontier began organizing support networks for orphaned children, recognizing that Mercy's vulnerability had made her an ideal victim for Daniel's manipulation. The Methodist Mission in Lexington, where Mercy was originally supposed to be placed, established new protocols for placing orphaned children with carefully vetted families rather than leaving them in institutional care. The Carver family, whose lives had been saved by Mercy's sacrifice, dedicated themselves to ensuring that her story would not be forgotten. John Carver used his legal expertise to help draft many of the new laws protecting frontier travelers, while his wife Sarah established a fund that provided education and support for orphaned children throughout the Kentucky Territory. Perhaps most poignantly, Mrs. Carver gave birth to a daughter 3 months after their escape and named her Mercy in honor of the girl who had died so that the child could live. That daughter, Mercy Carver, grew up knowing the story of her namesake's sacrifice and dedicated her own life to establishing schools for frontier children, ensuring that other orphaned girls would never again be as vulnerable as Mercy Harrow had been. The physical location where Mercy made her final stand became something of a shrine for travelers on the wilderness trail. For decades, families would stop at what became known as Mercy's Cave to leave flowers, children's toys, or small tokens of remembrance. Local Cherokee leaders, who had long been blamed for murders Daniel committed, participated in these memorial ceremonies as a way of honoring a girl who had cleared their name through her sacrifice. Modern historians who have studied the case estimate that the true number of victims may have been far higher than the documented murders. Daniel's network had been evolving their methods, becoming more sophisticated in how they selected targets and disposed of evidence. They had been planning to expand their operation to other major migration routes, including the Great Indian Warpath through Virginia and the Federal Road through the southeastern territories. Recovery efforts continued for years after the trial as investigators used Daniel's records to locate additional burial sites and identify remains. Families across the eastern states finally learned the fate of relatives who had simply vanished while traveling west, providing closure that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The case also revealed the broader criminal networks that had developed to support such operations. Daniel's group had connections with corrupt merchants in New Orleans, Charleston, and Richmond, who helped convert stolen goods into cash. These investigations led to additional arrests and exposed a level of organized crime that authorities had never suspected existed on the frontier. Yet for all the historical significance of her sacrifice, Mercy Harrow remains largely forgotten by mainstream American history. Her story survives primarily in regional archives, court records, and family documents, overshadowed by the broader narratives of Western expansion and frontier heroism. Perhaps this oversight reflects the uncomfortable truth that her story reveals, that even in America's earliest days, when communities were small and everyone supposedly knew their neighbors, the most dangerous predators were those who understood how to exploit trust and vulnerability. This mystery shows us that even in America's earliest days, when communities were small and everyone supposedly knew their neighbors, the most dangerous predators were those who understood how to exploit trust and vulnerability. Mercy Harrow's tragic story reminds us that heroism can emerge from the most unlikely sources, sometimes from a frightened, pregnant 13-year-old girl who found the courage to choose justice over survival when the lives of innocent children hung in the balance. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in the Kentucky wilderness? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how such crimes could have gone undetected for so long. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The frontier may be gone, but the lessons from Mercy Harrow's sacrifice remain as relevant today as they were over 2 centuries ago. See you in the next video.